My name is Marg Gordon, and I've attended and volunteered at the festival for many years. I no longer live in Moose Jaw, but the festival is a highlight of my summer, meeting and listening to authors and chatting with people who like to read. One of the reasons I chose this panel was the common theme that I see in the work of these three authors: discussion, description of trauma in all its forms. In my working life, I was involved in the legal system, and so it's a different way to relate for me to those experiences. Our first author this afternoon is Tamara Cherry. I confess, and I've already confessed to Tamara, that I did not know or had not heard about her and her work. But as I read her bio, I thought, it's okay, we have something in common. She's from my hometown of Regina, attended the U of R, and I just learned today her cousin and I went to law school together. Now, her cousin is on the Court of Appeal. That's where the similarity does end. But Tamara, I explained to her as well, people in my line of work, we tried to avoid reporters and journalists. We were terrified of you. Tamara, I think, is breaking down that stereotype. She's a critical thinker. She states that journalists need to think about the way stories are told, to be a storyteller, not just a story taker. She gives us some insights in her book about the difficult role of journalists and others working in trauma situations. After working in several big cities, most recently Toronto, she has returned to Regina, established Pickup Communications, a company that supports trauma survivors and the stakeholders that surround them. I've just purchased her book and had a quick look through it. It's going to be a great read, and I'd like to welcome Tamara. You're welcome. How do I?
I'm hoping that I use this mic correctly. Is it still on? Okay. Can you guys hear me? Okay. So thank you very much, Marg, and I hope I'm not looking so intimidating now. You know, reporters are usually intimidated by judges. As somebody who's had to stand up and speak from the body of the courtroom on behalf of myself, I can attest to the beating heart, having to stand in front of a judge and cross that line. Okay, so I'm reading from my book, The Trauma Beat, A Case for Rethinking the Business of Bad News, and I'll just give a quick bit of context. So, as Marg said, I left journalism to launch my company, which is a public relations firm that supports trauma survivors. And I thought at that time that I knew everything there was to know about trauma and the media and all the often ugly ways that the two intersect. But I launched a research project a few years ago and quickly realized how wrong I was and how much I had to learn. And what started as a research project that was intended to create training materials for victim service providers, homicide investigators, journalists, other people that can support survivors with the media, really became a very personally transformative process for me as I had to come to terms with all of the ways that I got things very wrong as a crime reporter over the span of about 15 years when I thought that my very good intentions were good enough. And I just want to give credit to my colleague and friend Duncan McHugh, who came up with the words, be a storyteller, not a story taker. It's one of my favorite lessons from this whole journey, and it's something that I repeat quite often. So thank you for repeating them today. All right, so I'm going to be reading from a chapter called A Morally Presumptive Chorus, which comments on basically the way that we in the media often report a little bit differently on marginalized communities, especially racialized communities. So this is starting from about the middle of the chapter. I think about a story I once covered in a neighborhood that had been plagued by gun violence, about the shooting of a beloved teacher whose murder, I said in my story, just did not make sense, as if all the other murders in that neighborhood had. I think about the survey I received from Evelyn Fox, whose son Kissinger was killed by a bullet that police said was meant for somebody else. I had a couple of reporters ask me outright if my son was gang affiliated in any way, Evelyn wrote. And even though my son was not, for me, that shouldn't matter. I think about all the ways reporters try to make sense of the senseless. I think about all the neighbors I've interviewed who have mentioned visitors at all hours and people coming and going. And when I heard someone was killed, I knew it would be that house. And how I regurgitated their comments and connected the dots until it was a story about a murder at a suspected drug den before we knew the victim, before we knew the perpetrator, before the police tape was even down, before we knew what the hell happened to precede the end of that life. I think about a news conference I covered at Toronto Police Headquarters just as I entered my third trimester with my firstborn child. We had been gathered there for an update on the case of 2 young men found shot to death on a dark Toronto street, both victims, they had seemed, of a gunman on the lam. We were told that there was no outstanding gunman, that there had been a chance encounter between 2 men with an outstanding beef, that there was a fight, and that both men drew their guns and fired at each other. I think about the woman standing at the back of the media gallery with the black trench coat and black scarf and big dark sunglasses, clutching a framed photo of a smiling young man who looked much different from his tough-looking mugshot on display by police. She wasn't there as an invited guest, as homicide survivors usually are. In fact, she and the mother of the other young man would later tell Toronto Star reporter Wendy Gillis that they had not even been notified ahead of time of what information would be released. Rather, the woman in the black trench coat and scarf and big dark sunglasses had rushed to police headquarters after learning a press conference would be held to announce the homicides had been solved. But oddly placed as she was behind all the cameras, I sensed that she wanted to talk, as people who show up unannounced at news conferences and people clutching pictures generally do. And so following the news conference, I gestured for the camera person I was working with to join me, and we walked toward the woman. And all the other reporters and cameras and microphones got into position, and the homicide investigator walked out of the room. My son is the love of my life, and this has been a very difficult time for our entire family, and no other parent should ever have to go through this kind of loss, the woman told us. Her son was troubled, yes, she conceded through tears, ever since his father had died in a car crash 5 years earlier. But he also had a house and a job and a woman he loved and a young child now sentenced to a life without a father. Mothers are victims too, regardless of the situation, she told us. I have lost the love of my life. Shauna Brown is grateful her son Damal was painted in a positive light. But she knows many other mothers who are not so fortunate, and she sees many things that need to change in the way the media covers murders, particularly the murders of young black men. On the 23rd of July, it was my son, but a couple days later, it was somebody else, she tells me. Even though the headline and the spotlight moved to somebody else, all those people are still sitting and dealing with those feelings. And the words that were written in the paper or spoken on TV or asked in a question can exist both online and in the minds of the survivors for years to come. Would you say to the mother of the rape victim, why was she there? Why was she dressed like that? No, you wouldn't. It's similar. They're victims. By distracting from their victimhood, Shauna says, the media is absolving us, all of us, of our shared responsibility to curb the gun violence that is hurting so many families. So many families in so few neighborhoods. So many families who so often had so much trauma even before they lost someone in their immediate family. Near the beginning of my career, I wrote about a 17-year-old girl who, in the span of 6 months, had been to 6 funerals for young people killed violently. If I lose somebody else who's close to me, it's not going to be good, she told me. I don't want to be depressed. I want to be happy. I want to show people that I can be happy. You've got hurt people hurting people, Shauna says about an hour and a half into our conversation, and you've got tons of trauma and layers of trauma that have not been dealt with. She recalls a conversation she had with Damal about a year before he was murdered. Sitting around the kitchen table, they had tallied up all the people they'd lost in the last 10 years. Some had died from natural causes, and a huge number had died from gun violence, she says. You've got trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. I asked Shauna if she feels her community and all its interconnectedness of trauma is being ignored by the media. Most definitely, she replies, ignored by the media. I can't help but think of Gregory Stewart's mother. My son did not deserve this. My son did not deserve this. He did not deserve this. Walking around the house where her son was murdered, recording a video on her cell phone, desperate for someone to pay attention, for journalists to come to East St. Louis where, I click through my notes, 95% of residents are Black. I begin clicking through articles, encyclopedias, commemorative videos, researching East St. Louis history back to the First World War, when the city was mostly white and Black people came looking for work and white people became angry. Rights journalist Kelsey Landis, politicians spread conspiracies about Black residents' role in voter fraud. Newspapers fanned the flames of rumors about Black migrants causing crime. Local government and union leaders exaggerated the number of Black Southerners migrating to East St. Louis and their effects on the local economy. On July 2nd, 1917, the racism reached a harrowing peak. The mob, made up of white men and women, began attacking Black men, women, and children alike. They pulled them from streetcars and beat them, shot them, threw stones at them, murdered and maimed them, hanged them from lampposts, and dumped their bodies in a nearby creek. The mob looted Black residents' home and then set them on fire. It was a massacre, and it was fueled, in part, by the media. The racism of 1917 was unapologetic, overt, loud, and violent. And as in so many communities across North America, as the white folks moved out and the Black folks moved in, the racism settled into the ground, was soaked up by our roots, and nurtured through the generations until it was predominantly systemic, covertly dictating who would get the jobs, which schools would get the funding, who would be incarcerated, and how the media would cover stories of trauma. I've met a lot of journalists from across North America. From what I've observed, the overwhelming majority of them are not overtly racist, but the system on which our industry has been built is inescapably so. As such, whether they realize it or not, many journalists are participating in and upholding this racist system. The published hearsay about the young Black man in Toronto who is said to have done some dastardly stuff before we even knew his name, before we learned he'd been killed at random. The former gang member descriptor for the Black man who was murdered while running to someone's aid, even though, the inspector said, this was not a gang slaying. The grieving mother standing at the podium, defending her murdered Black son as if he were the killer and not the unsuspecting victim. The mother who spent hours wiping blood from the hole in her Black son's head, only to be asked by a journalist if her son ran with gangs. Known to police, said the man in the button-up shirt, a device utilized to demean, injure, and dehumanize the victim. Do you think race played a role in that journalist asking you whether Kissinger was gang affiliated? I ask Evelyn Fox. Yes, she replies, and I ask her to explain. Black victims are always vilified, Evelyn says. People automatically assume they were part of a gang and attempt to rationalize why they were killed. It's sickening. It is the main reason why Black mothers don't come forward to plead for help to find their children's killer. And the reason Shauna Brown knew so quickly, so instinctively, amid her deep, impossible grief, that she had to get ahead of the story after Jamal was murdered. I tell Shauna about the conversation I had with journalist Beth Hundsdorfer about East St. Louis. I tell her about how Beth said the media coverage of homicides in high-crime neighborhoods represented another way these marginalized communities were being failed. I ask Shauna if she thinks the situation is the same up here in Canada, in Toronto, that families of young Black men who have already fallen through so many cracks are being failed again by the media in the way their deaths are being covered. Oh yeah, she says, most definitely. I would support that, yes. That's all for today. I have to turn mine off, sorry.
Whoops. Well, thank you, Tamara. You packed a lot in that 10 minutes. Our next author is Dr. Norma Dunning. Norma is Padley Inuk. She is a scholar, a researcher, grandmother, professor, and a storyteller. She has a PhD in Indigenous Peoples Education and teaches at the University of Alberta, but that's not going to be the case. Norma just was telling Tamara and I she's moving to Regina, has bought a house, and a big change. That's what life's all about, isn't it? I have just finished her short story collection, Danena, The Unseen Ones. This morning she read a short story from one of her other books. I have to tell you, I love short stories. And that does it, Norma. You are on the top shelf of my bookcase at home with the likes of Alice Munro and other short storytellers. While Norma states that the stories and characters in her work are fiction, I agree with one reviewer who commented, readers will quickly realize that Tamara is a work of real-life fiction. The characters may be fabricated, but the stories are undoubtedly ones of many truths. This book, Tanea, will break your heart and mend it and break it again. Welcome.
Can you hear me? Is there anybody out there? You know, the fun thing about this bright light is you can't see anything out there. And so you just have to kind of wonder. And it's true, I'm moving to Regina on August 1st. I've accepted an assistant professorship with the First Nations University. And thank you. Thank you. So I'm really excited, and I'd like to thank the Saskatchewan Writers Guild. It has always been so kind and so very, very generous to me, and I've always appreciated being able to come here. And actually, 3 of my sons were born in Prince Albert. I lived in PA for 8 years. Oh dear, there's somebody from PA. So it's, you know, to be able to be coming back in August, it's almost like coming home, you know. I'm going to read from the last story in Diana, The Unseen Ones. And before I get started, I want you to know that this story is based on a 2005 case that did happen in Edmonton. There was an Inuvialuit girl whose body was found on a golf course when springtime came along and snow was melting. And initially, she had 0 ID on her. So no purse, no driver license, nothing. And the only thing the police could do was they took a picture of her hoodie, front and back, because they knew it was not a local or, even a big box brand of a hoodie. The design was very different. And that's what they started to put into the paper, because she had no ID, but she had this unusual hoodie. And then the police start talking about how, we'll do a toxicology and, it'll explain her life. But her toxicology came back clean. She remains one of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in our country. And I thought about her for a long, long time, and I followed that story and found her Facebook page, and all those years later, many years later, I decided to write about her. So she is the final story. She is the title of the book, Diana, The Unseen Ones. Billy Townsend slid his skinny ass onto the John Deere lawnmower. It was still a bit dark out, leaving the early spring morning air heavily scented with dew. He loved that smell. One of the best things about his job was being able to go out onto the golf course and drive the mower in the early morning. After 3 decades of military assignments that scattered his life with time zones, this early morning duty was his simplest. He had finally reached that point in his life where he could relax at work, something he had never been able to do when serving his country. Today was the first mowing of the greens for the season, one of his favorite days. He knew that it would be a long day, but the first mow was always the best mow. He had seen it all during his years of service, so many cold nights during desert storms, so many hot, sweltering days when you begged God for a breeze. And when it came, it was loaded with sand that would seep its way into every crack of your body, every line on your face. In his final years, in those final years, there's actually an error. There's a typo right now. I have to take this up with Douglas and McIntyre. Sincerely. He put in those final years and got the hell out onto Civvy Street, where his biggest concern was getting through the Tim Hortons drive-thru on his way to work. It was a simple life now. He liked the routine of his days, the hum and flow of life without others to answer to. Each spring, summer, and early fall, all he had to do was mow the lawn. He smiled as he thought of his French military buddies making fun of him and calling him Billy Mow the Lawn. He hummed in time with his mower motor as he headed off toward the first green. Cresting the small hill, he looked down upon a flock of Canada geese sitting in a circle with their necks pointing outwards, sitting like bison do when protecting their young against aggressors. Billy couldn't believe his eyes. He put his mower into stealth mode and moved silently towards the geese. There must be 60 of them, he thought. He had never seen this formation. He had never seen geese behave like this. Not that he was a hunter, not that he really understood nature, but he knew a bit of this and that. And of this, he was certain. Geese did not sit in bison circles. He eased his mower toward the circle. Not one of the geese moved. Not one goose let loose a honk. Not one of them lifted its head from under its wing. Billy didn't understand it. He was confused. He felt like he was in a bad dream where everything falls into slow motion. He touched his left pocket to make sure he had his cell phone. How was he going to explain what he had seen when he called his wife? Here he was, a decorated soldier, a man who had served his country, who had sat through raids and had had Spitfire artillery splashing all around him. And now, here he sat frozen, a couple of yards away from a flock of geese sitting in a circle and acting as passive as Gandhi. He didn't know what to do. Play duck, duck, goose with them? He started to whistle London Bridge is falling down. Not one goose lifted its head. He started to sing, "Oh, when the saints come marching in," and not one goose lifted its head. Billy decided to stand on his machine and flap his arms, calling out to them in a language he was sure they would understand. Honk, honk. Not one goose lifted its head. Finally, he jumped off his machine and decided to take a run at them. He put his head down and dug his right foot into the thick Kentucky bluegrass and pushed his body forward with his head wrapped inside his tattooed forearms. "Arr!" he growled. And when he looked up, he saw the geese taking a few steps. They were cluttering his daybreak. He stood in awe as all 60 of them swelled into the beautiful first light canvas of red and soft blue. He felt the tears slip from one eye and sighed. What a beautiful sight. What a gorgeous start to his day. If he were a religious man, he would have called it a blessing. His body turned in a slow semicircle following the pattern of the wings taking flight. All he could think to do was to applaud the symphony of geese that filled the sunrise. His hands pounded against one another and reached high over his head. A singular standing O. He was in a state of amazement. Amazed at the beauty of life, amazed at nature, amazed and grateful for being alive. He shook his head and uttered a quiet thank you to the sky, smacked his wide palm against his lips and blew a kiss heavenward. He turned back toward his machine, and that was when he saw it, a lump. A lump curled up in the fetal position. He walked toward the lump and turned on the flashlight app on his phone. A body, not a lump, a frozen body. It had clearly been lying on the fairway through winter. He stepped carefully toward it. It wasn't moving. There was no breath rising from the shoulders. There was nothing. He shouted, "Hello?" even though he knew there was no point, no movement. He knew he shouldn't touch it, but he couldn't help himself. He put the toe of his running shoe against the right shoulder of the body and gave it a gentle tap. No movement. Rigor mortis had turned this body into a solid heap of solid decay. He told himself just one more try before he dialed out. Billy shoved the shoulder hard enough to see that it was a woman's face inside of a black hoodie. He made the call that no one ever wants to make. He dialed 911. "My name is Major General Billy Townsend. I just found a dead Indigenous woman on the golf course that I work at. Thank you."
Our final author in this session is Michelle Good. And I have to confess as well, another reason I signed up for this session, and likely the first reason, is at the time I had read Michelle's book, Five Little Indians. And I always figure that's a bonus if you're introducing authors to have read their book. As one reviewer says about this book, an amazing book. Through 5 people, we are shown the horrors, struggles, and potential for joy in their lives. Michelle is a member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation. She worked with many Indigenous organizations, and then, I was saying this to her, for some strange reason, decided to go to law school. A brave move when you have so many other talents. In any event, she practiced law primarily advocating for residential school survivors. In 2014, she obtained a master's in fine arts in creative writing. She has written fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. Please welcome Michelle Good.
Can you hear me? So, ooh. So yeah, I wrote that book. Then I wrote another one. And I'm really thankful to have the opportunity to have these conversations, to come to events like this so that we can inspire each other to engage in necessary dialogues that will move the concept of reconciliation forward. Five Little Indians, after I wrote it, and it had the alarming success and just a phenomenal response, and a demonstrated willingness of so many people to engage in these difficult conversations. I set aside the second novel that I was working on and decided to write a collection of essays, which is what we have here. It's called Truth Telling, 7 Conversations about Indigenous Life in Canada. And I have often referred to residential schools as an implement in the colonial toolkit. And that's what they were. That's what they are still felt as. But they weren't the first implement in the colonial toolkit, nor the last. And given the response to Five Little Indians, I thought, this is a moment, this is a time when there is a willingness and an opportunity to speak about some of those other implements. So I'm going to read to you today, reading tomorrow, so we'll carry on from here. But I'm going to read for you today the introduction to the collection and a couple of little excerpts from that. And I understand when we're done, my friends will join me and we can have some questions. Before that, I think about this unusual source that I find quite inspirational in terms of the context of the work I'm doing. And it's a statement by Anais Nin. And she said, "When others asked the truth of me, I was convinced it was not the truth they wanted, but an illusion they could bear to live with." John Trudell, activist, poet, amazing human being, said, "When one lives in a society where people can no longer rely on the institutions to tell them the truth must come from culture and art." And I say, sit with me by this dialogue fire. At the watershed moment in Canadian history, when the Truth and Reconciliation Report was issued by the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair, the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair positioned truth as mandatory and a precedent for reconciliation. articulating the fundamental principle that without truth there can be no reconciliation. This phrase has become like an anthem in the raised voices of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people alike. The urgent demand for truth has become a call to action in itself. The problem with anthems, though, is that they tend to become rote, like an absent-minded genuflection, a premeditated land acknowledgement, reduced to the sound of the words without mindful consideration or intention to follow through. These public gestures are simply a tipping of the hat without any commitment towards substantive recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples to inherent jurisdiction in our territories. Truth is more than fact. In Canada, truth must be unearthed from beneath the myth of Canadian history. That history must be understood in a deeply contextual way if we are to move beyond positional and confrontational relationships and into functional ones dedicated to substantive change. We must step away from the window dressing of reconciliation. We must come to a place of understanding that the colonial history of Canada was genocidal in nature, functioning as an imperative embedded in the very heart of colonialism. The conversation, academic and otherwise, about colonialism articulate its complexity, and we see work in its derivatives, post-colonialism, neo-colonialism, settler colonialism, and so on. Each of these iterations and more generate important and elucidative study. At the same time, I find, it distracts from the fundamental meaning of colonialism, and it is critical that its ugly heart not be lost in the study of it. Colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. That's it. That's all. This is the unvarnished, grasping truth of the intention of colonizing European nations that set their sights on the riches of the so-called New World. Human settlement was only secondary to the economic goal. The colonizing settlers are simply the drones in the beehive of colonial ventures, their value limited to how well they enrich the various states who financed the colonial venture. I often visualize what I refer to as the colonial toolkit, a collection of implements used to activate the aims of colonialism. All the implements in the toolkit were and are employed to remove us from our lands, disempower us in decisions about our lands and resources, dismantle our highly effective social institutions, and dismember our families and communities. To accomplish these colonial goals, there were, for example, policies established that mandated the starvation of Indigenous peoples to force their submission, to dismantle traditional family structures, social institutions, and community systems. We saw policy and law mandating the wholesale removal of children for the placement in residential schools for the sole purpose of deconstructing them and reconstructing them in the image of white men. To understand the brutal circumstances Indigenous people of Turtle Island continue to endure, we must reach under the myth of Canadian history. We must embrace history in the way Indigenous peoples experienced it as it truly unfolded. Only then will non-Indigenous Canadians begin to grasp the true horror of what we were subjected to and how the seeds of that horror continue to sprout and take hold in our lives today. It is also important to understand that history does not only refer to events almost lost to the mist of time. History is also contemporary. Contextually, the history of relations between Indigenous peoples and those who settled here must be understood in the context of first contact, but also in times as recent as last year. The history of Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationships is on a continuum from the beginning to now and must be understood that way if non-Indigenous Canadians are ever to grasp what the prerequisite to substantive reconciliation in fact are. To participate meaningfully in reconciliation, non-Indigenous Canadians must not only be supportive, but must also insist that the resources, natural, political, and financial, required for substantive change are generously and enthusiastically provided as needed and articulated by Indigenous peoples. Non-Indigenous Canadians must use their privilege to leverage real change. It is simply not enough to wear an orange shirt or issue empty land acknowledgements. The non-Indigenous population of this country must not only talk, they must also act. These are not academic essays in this book, neither are they exhaustive. They are my personal take on this new world brought to us by colonialism, a world in which we will struggle to survive. We still struggle to survive. These essays examine the brutal intentions of colonialism that continue to harm us, whether that be in the form of starvation policies, residential schools and their child welfare descendants, the acceptance of brutality against our women, the dishonesty of government, or the insufficiency of monetary compensation. I encourage readers to consider Indigenous reality in the true context of these histories, to deepen their understanding and call upon their own compassion and responsibility to engage in these conversations beyond the last page. During momentous occasions, many Indigenous people engage in the ceremonial practice of lighting a spirit fire to engage the ancestors, so to speak. The fire remains burning day and night until the occasion is complete. These essays are intended to spark dialogue, to provide a deeper view of both early and contemporary history through the lens of Indigenous experience. Let us together light a dialogue fire. Let us keep that flame alive until the truth overcomes the colonial lie. Okay. The hook. Thanks.
Well, I think we could have had a double session for these three authors. I'm not a good timekeeper and I don't like interrupting. Anyways, let's just take a few questions. We do have to be out of here on time or close to on time. So 3 or 4 minutes. Are there any quicker questions? What a stupid thing to say, isn't it? Yeah, small questions. No. Now after that, nobody wants to ask a question. Well, after all that.
There you go.
Oh, there, the expert.
As you just said, what question can I ask that we could wrap up so quickly? These are such deep, complex issues that I don't think that we could really do anything justice in the span of a few minutes. My mind is going like 80 kilometers an hour after listening to both of you and thinking about allyship and how you can be a better ally. But honestly, there's nothing that I can ask right now that we can really do justice to. I just want to say that, I look forward to reading more from both of you and learning from both of you.
And what do you think the question should be that everybody should be asking and looking to answer in their own lives outside of this session.
You know, I teach only you leave it with me, right? So don't, you know, like, this is not scripted. I don't know what she was going to say.
It's all because I got her that cup of coffee.
That's it. But one of the things I have my students do is, and I only teach Indigenous-based courses, and I do spend 90 minutes reading them the Indian Act. And it becomes actually like a 90-minute performance. But it has to be, or else they're not going to stay with you, you know. So one of the things that they have to write on is what is their personal act of reconciliation that they will do throughout the next year. And I've had students write, I'm going to wear my orange shirt not once a year, but once a week. And they talk about finding and supporting Indigenous writers and artists and really making their own personal effort to do something. And their ideas are so much more creative than anything that I could ever even think of. And so I'm always pleased with it. So I always think, you know, what is and each of us, and this involves Indigenous people as well. It's not just non-Indigenous people, it's all of us. Like, what is your personal act of reconciliation? And informing yourself, you know, honestly, by a few books, like all of mine.
Yes.
And shameless self-promotion.
And the books are available, and the authors will be in the lower level after we conclude. And a reminder that you will have a chance to hear these authors again over the course of the next day and a half. But very reluctantly, we are going to have to end it there. Thank you for inspiring us.
Take the last word.
Okay.
And that is, the thing that I always ask people to do is reconsider what you think you know.
Ah.
Yeah.